Right. Right. Well, where to start with this? It is a perennial question. Where do ideas come from? And to be a bit technical, the part of the brain that has ideas, that daydreams and does those random thoughts, is not the same part of the brain that does systematic analysis. They're different parts of the brain, they're different processes. And I have said this before, but I will repeat it. Niels Bohr, who was a physicist who was at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, was defining the atom. He had a notion about the two different parts of the brain, and he figured out that the analytical part of the brain is significantly slower and less efficient than the part of the brain that does the daydreaming. And he came up with this notion of the gunslinger reaction. And his idea was that in a duel of people of absolutely equal ability, the person who moves first always loses, because he is thinking and the other party is reacting, and the reacting comes from that other part of the brain. So when you're asking ideas, oh, by the way, Birmingham University proved that point. They set up a series of tests and were able to demonstrate that that's correct. One other thing that's been discovered recently is when you are daydreaming, your brain is significantly harder working than when you're doing something like quadratic equations. And the theory is that it's about 30% harder working. And the way people can measure how hard your brain is working is that famous measure of work, heat. Your brain is generating 30% more heat when you're daydreaming than when you're thinking or working really hard with some mathematical problem. So, having gone over that, the trick is how to disengage that analytical part of the mind and engage with the daydreaming part usefully. So
this isn't a conversation, this is you doing a monologue.
Yes, you're quite right. I've not done this as a conversation, but I thought, well, let's see.
But I thought, as I'm here, why shouldn't I take the airtime?
Come on then.
Well, no, it was just weird that when you were saying this, literally when I went for my run today, I heard a story that I think I've told you before, but that I really liked, which describes that point exactly. So I think it's one of those things that artists or writers know instinctively, that idea of the mind being at work when it looks like you're... Anyway, the story is there's a French impressionist painter, I don't know which one, and he's sitting in his garden and he's just looking out at the flowers and the wind through the grass and enjoying the wind and the sun on his skin, and his neighbour walks past and looks over the fence and he says, "Oh, you're having a rest, are you?" And he says, "No, I'm working." And the neighbour sort of wanders off. And then the next day, the artist, he's set up his easel and he's started painting, and he's painting all the things that he sees in the garden, and the neighbour walks past and he says, "Oh, you're working, are you?" And he says, "No, I'm at rest." But that's the same point, isn't it? It's that time to process things, to allow yourself, that time for things to percolate. That's the work. The physical bit is the easy thing.
It's the easy thing, relatively speaking. We have to learn that trick of disengaging the part of our brain that's worrying and fretting and think, "Oh God, I've got to come up with an idea."
Although I like the other one as well, which is that Calvin and Hobbes one, where Hobbes comes up to Calvin and he's just playing in a sandpit, and Hobbes is like, "Aren't you supposed to be doing your homework?" And Calvin says, "I'm waiting for that creative mood to strike me so I can begin." And Hobbes said, "What's that?" And he said, "Last minute panic." And so that's the other one as well. The other great motivating creative impetus. A deadline.
I'm not so sure that's true.
No, you don't pay attention to them at all, do you? It's not your...
Well, I'm not usually late. I mean, we had a policy when we were designing stages that and album covers, if the cover isn't right and you deliver it and you needed another day doing it, working on it to get it just right, take that extra day, because if you don't, it's going to be out there forever wrong. But the opposite is true with the stage. If it has to be there for a live performance on this date at this time, it's just got to be there. If it's not finished, tie yourself onto the back of the truck and finish it.
So did you feel panicked when you were doing things like stage sets? Does that change the way that you create ideas if you have an absolute deadline that you can't alter? Do you have to create differently? Do you have to just make yourself? Can you make yourself?
I think that's exactly the time when you must not panic. Without mentioning too many names, Martin was mostly responsible for building the stage. And on the first stage we built, it was very complicated to get two curves match. And the person who was in charge of the team doing the fiberglassing work was building up and building up and building up with plaster to make the curves match. And Martin said, you've got to stop doing that. We can't have that much weight on it. And he said, we haven't got time. We've got to make them match. And Martin said, look, go home, get some sleep. And there was a big row because we only had, well, I don't remember how long, but 24 or 48 hours. And he was desperate to get this right. And Martin says, no good, you can't work that way. And I remember Martin just walked around it. He walked around it and said nothing, did nothing, walked around it, and then marked some lines with a pen. And the following morning, it was still looking wrong. And I keep wanting to say his name. He says, what have you done? We haven't finished. There's no time. He said, make cuts where those lines are. And as he made the cuts, the one that was wrong gradually sagged right into place, and it matched. And that was an example of Martin not panicking, figuring it out, coming up with a solution. And it's panic and anxiety are not useful tools to have.
No, actually, when I think of times when I've really felt like that, what it feels like is mentally just screwing yourself into a hole.
Yeah.
When what you want to be doing is coasting on the top. And I was listening again today about how there's this sort of theme of artists in the last century, particularly, of being kind of excessive in lots of different ways, alcohol or drugs or whatever it might be. And the theory that this person had was that for a creative person, if you've ever had that creativity suppressed or hindered, excess is a way of pushing it further, because you're loosening your own boundaries and you can do more and all of that kind of thing. And it's not necessary. It's a sort of palliative, a kind of way of ameliorating whatever trauma you'd had to do with suppressing your creativity. But I think there's another aspect of it, which is that if your mind does that thing screwing itself into the ground, having a glass of wine sometimes can be
I'm
quite...
not recommending it. I don't drink.
No, for me, I go for a run.
Right.
Or I go for a walk around the block, or I go out and see a friend, because it is much more efficient often to take your mind out.
I do that. I go for a walk.
Rather than keep pushing it. But the point that I'm making is that I just sort of, I can understand why lots of artists and writers try and use something to break that chain of spiralling.
Well, you have to break it. I personally would recommend something like meditation or walking. I think walking on pathways in the country is incredibly good for meditation and readjusting your mind. I think it's important to get out of that loop. And I was going to say terrorism or the dictatorship of the blank page or the blank canvas. It's very oppressive. And all kinds of art school teachers have different methods of dealing with that. My professor at the Royal College would say, don't look at it, start making marks, and at some point they'll start making sense.
What I do, which I find really useful, is if I have a project that I'm really stuck on, I do 2 active imagination kind of activities. I sort of sit and imagine what would it look like or feel like if I really enjoyed this? What would I be doing? How would I be making it look if this was really fun for me?
Yes.
And the other thing is, what, by the end of this, how impressive could I make this? What would be the most extraordinary outcome that I could physically manifest? And then I can get excited. So if I can imagine enjoying it and then imagine an outcome that I can be really excited about, that can often get me into something as well.
I mean, one of the things we can talk about probably another time is there are dozens of little tricks that go from what now to yes, and get moving, to actually get moving with excitement and a real pace, and you know that you're pulling it together. Ideas are often grasped very briefly. You know, a fantastic idea probably doesn't take a month to come together. It probably takes a nanosecond. It's the execution that takes time. And how do you lock into it? How do you take that nanosecond, record it, and extrapolate it?
This is going to sound really egomaniacal, but one of the things that I've found great for having that first idea for something is if I go for a run and I listen to music that's incredibly emotional and often sweepy melodies, and I picture myself on the opening night of an exhibition standing in front of a piece of work that's so amazing. Everyone's just, how did she possibly accomplish that in her small lifetime on this, that kind of thing. and then you get fed an image of what that is. You can't help it. It's like not thinking of a black cat when you say the word black cat. If you make yourself imagine you're in the opening preview of your exhibition in front of an incredible piece of artwork, your mind will just throw something up, and it will do its best, because you're not telling it to make something wonderful. You're just saying, if I was there, and then it will fit something behind you.
Yes.
Whether you can make it or not is something that I think is not so important. It's that first image.
One of the things which we'll come to another time is, over the years I've interviewed lots of artists and musicians and writers and some scientists, and they all have the same experience, that the idea turns up. It's not constructed. It's not beaten into shape. It turns up ready formed.
And I would say there are times in particular where it does, like after a run. And I keep going on about this, but I think there's something about, I think the endorphins, you're like in a heightened state, but it's this glowy, happy, kind of nothing to lose-y sort of feeling. And often, like when I live in Tokyo normally, and I do a round of the park, and almost every life-changing decision I've made has been in that 10-minute walk from the end of the park to my apartment. And some of them.
Yeah.
But every time I make a big decision, it's in that walk, and I'll just be like, do you know what? It's time I did this. Or, why haven't I done that? It's
why
easy.
haven't I told Dad to do that?
Yes. Sometimes I'll make a phone call right after my jog and be like, can you get this for me? I need to do this thing. But, that's all part of the process.
Well, a very important part of the process, which we're running out of time on, but I'd like to do this again, is how you take that idea, whatever it is, and bring it into the world, to give it form, to give it shape. I mean, it's called being creative, or the creative process, but you have to go from an idea to something material, physical in the world.
And you can't give too much away because that's the first week.
No, you
in
can't
our
not give
lesson.
too much away.
No, of
You've got
course.
to keep giving too much away. That's the thing.
Did you want to show these? Have we got time?
Not really. We go on a little longer today.
I can't see your comments or questions. I hope you've been enjoying this and that we're in shot and the mic hasn't fallen out or something and you've just been watching us mime.
I take this with me all the time, whether I'm going on a journey or even if I'm nipping out to put petrol in the car. It would not occur to me not to travel with it.
Do you want to show it?
Well, these are some sketches we did before I started the painting. And these are sketchbooks where I've had them made up, and I guess what I'm showing you here, Freya, is sketches with those very colourful crayons. But it's transparent, so I like the fact I can see the drawing underneath.
We should end.
Yes, we'll start again with this next time.
Someone just mentioned, as just a final thought, I just got one of the things saying they can't have critical people around them when they're working. And I heard of a really interesting exercise, which was that you have an inner critic, and often it's made up of the voices of people who've been critical to you in your life. And one exercise that you can do is imagine this person. It doesn't matter what they look like, if it's a real person or an amalgam or a total figment of your imagination, and have a conversation with them and see what they're trying to get at you about. See if it's founded on anything. See if you can make friends with them. See if you can politely disagree and go your separate ways, and find some way of dealing with it directly rather than just allowing it to have that kind of silent track ongoing.
I would say, more importantly than that, self-criticism and external criticism has no place in the creative process. You need to absolutely separate it. You make something one day here, another day over there, you can analyse it and criticise it. You come back and you create more, you can analyse it, but you don't mix the two. And you don't let anyone else mix the two, because it's the death of the project.
I also wanted to show this. As we're talking about creativity, I was quite pleased with this arrangement that I made. Some people might say it's ugly. Why have you got wildflowers and grass in there and some morning glory? And I say, why wouldn't you? They're all beautiful. And they make these weird, interesting shapes together. Someone might criticise that. I don't care. We should stop. Have you got any final thoughts?
I had an anecdote, but I'll tell you after you switch off.
You can't say that.
No, I'll bring it up next week, but we'll let you get your life back.
Okay, thank you guys so much for joining us again.
Thank you very much.
And see you Wednesday, 7 p.m. English time, whatever that time is for you, where you are.
Yep.